Good afternoon to everyone that's joined us from Europe, and good morning for those of you that have joined from the States and Canada. So for those of you that are based in the UK, thanks for joining. I know it's been an exciting day with the budget and a few surprises, a bit more pressure for payroll people. And if you're not based in the UK and you're processing UK payrolls, you might want to have a look at the budget update. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that today. I'm delighted to say that we've got Richard Lincoln joining us. So we're just going to wait just for a few seconds, as always, for everyone to join us. It's been a while, hasn't it, Richard?
It's been a while, Mel, but delighted to be invited back. I appreciate it. I can't believe you opened by telling people to go away and do something else. But
no, I mean after this. No, after this webinar. Don't look at the UK budget now. I'm sorry, Richard.
more interesting than the.
No, I was going to say I actually think this is going to be more interesting than the budget. There's just two major things that you just need to know about with the UK budget, but you can find out about that afterwards. Okay, so I'm gonna shut up, and I'm sure I haven't made people leave this webinar. So today Richard is going to talk about payroll and the employee experience, which is really important, isn't it? It's one of the most, I think, important aspects of any business. So just before we start, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and the slides will be made available. If you do have any questions, please add them in the chat. We like the sessions to always be interactive. So if you've got any questions, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. And we have a few polls as well. So if you can indulge me by answering them, that's great, because it gives us a good idea of what you guys think. So I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to come off camera. Thanks so much, Richard, and I'll pass it over to you.
Super. Thanks so much, Mel, and thanks for having us back again. My name's Richard Limpkin. I'm VP of Multi-Country Payroll at UKG and co-founder of Amidus. So for those of you who don't know, Amidus was acquired in July by UKG. So we're operating in a whole new world now in a really, really exciting space. I'm going to talk to you today about payroll and the impact it can have on employee experience and every facet of that. It's probably one of the most fundamental things in terms of impacting how an employee feels, how they engage, what their interactions are with you as an employing organization. So there's some really key parts to that. I've spent most of my career in HR and payroll technology, typically in the middle of where all those things intersect. And payroll has always been a really key part of everything I've been involved in. So I guess I've experienced it from inside an organization, as a supplier to customers, as a customer, and always as an employee as well. So it's something I feel very close to and is critically important in terms of how we interact. How we manage payroll and how we process it is just one base aspect. And often you can look at these things as almost a hygiene factor. Like payroll just has to be right. And it's something I'd always advocate. If you don't get that right, then a lot of other stuff doesn't matter. So we'll talk about how all of that fits together and really the critical importance of how you can positively impact employee experience through what you do in the payroll space, but also other areas that touch on payroll. Payroll is a critical part of the employee experience, but there are many other things that feed into that as well. So maybe thinking first of all of some of the evolution of employee expectation, and it's a key thing to think about really. If we're not meeting expectation in anything we do, then that leads to disappointment and dissatisfaction. So from an employee perspective, understanding what that expectation is and how that expectation differs for different segments of your employee base and the wider market is really, really important. So there's obviously been a lot of evolution of that. And for any organization, you're likely to have anywhere up to 40, 50 years of employee differing population demographics within your organization, as well as lots of other dimensions to that. So purely from an age perspective and a generational perspective, this has obviously evolved a lot. I'm not going to tell you which of these I am, but it definitely does influence heavily behavior and how we perceive the world, what our expectation is, how we interact with things. And when we talk about expectation, it's all sorts of different dimensions to that expectation. It's how we expect to be treated, what we think our interactions should be with others, what we feel we should be presented with in terms of what technology we have at our disposal within the organization and without. They're all different dynamics. So as an employer, it's incredibly challenging to figure out how to interact with all these different generational aspects, as well as layering on the other dimensions that play in that as well. That gets even more complex in a multi-country environment, as you can well imagine. So really understanding the makeup of your organization and the different populations within it is actually a critical part of starting on the journey of actually helping with employee experience. So one of the poll questions we're going to ask, first of all, is really getting an understanding as people providing payroll in your organization, do you have a good sense of what the breakdown and demographic in your organization is? So Mel, maybe we'll jump to the first poll at this point, if that's okay.
There you go. Can you see that on the screen?
Yeah, that's popped up.
Fab. Okay. So I shouldn't admit this, but I didn't know until now that I was Gen X, but Richard already guessed that. Didn't you? And I said, so it's good
I guess that's the fact that you didn't know. So
I don't know what that means about me, but so we've got a comment, great slide. As Gen X, I have a hard time understanding the younger generations.
I think that goes with any generation. Actually, relating to and understanding others is part of the challenge, and understanding different positions, different dynamics, different perspectives, and how to relate across them. Like, that's the definition of the challenge in this space, and being able to provide for all of an employee population and hitting the right things in the different areas. That's really what we're talking about, is how do you fit that together in a holistic way that touches on the things that matter to each individual in a way that you can actually do at scale. It's really hard.
Yeah. So I'll just give it a couple more seconds if that's okay, Richard. What do you think is going to come up as the top one on this one?
I'm going to guess majority Gen Y, but could well be wrong.
Oh, I've got another comment there. I think many really don't know the spread of ages in their workplaces. It's a good point to start looking, I suppose, or research.
Yeah, that's the key. We'll talk a little bit in a while about technology aspects, but actually, like, that's a simple demographic that is easily attainable for any organization with the right tech in place. And when you start to twist and blend that information with other dimensions, it gets really, really interesting. So I think that's I think the fact that people don't know that, there's definitely work can be done to get them to a place where they can not only know it, but know what to do with that to get to actionable insight. That gets really fun. Okay,
so I'm going to end the poll. And here are the results.
There we go, Gen Y, 60%.
Yeah.
Yeah, not surprised. Gen X in there. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I think that would be a fairly typical dynamic. So yeah, I think the key thing to take out of that is really just understanding that it can have some really useful insights as to how people relate to your organization and what you can do for them. So thinking a little bit about what people's expectation is, I use maybe a recent study by Gallup. It looked across about 13,000 employees in the US, and it revealed stuff that I think a lot of people working in payroll will not be surprised by. That number one and number two were pay related, pay, comp and ben, lump that together, and then well-being. They were the top two things that came out on that survey. And I'll touch on that later on, but I would never be surprised by that. If pay, as we said earlier, is wrong, or it's insufficient, or it's felt to be unfair or not to market, it's very difficult for other things to be right. Like Maslow figured that out in, I think, 1943, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, it's one of the most fundamental components because it actually enables so many other things. Now, the other stuff that was really interesting in this survey, actually understanding that 47% of people had expectations around well-being, and that's risen significantly. And I think this is one of the generational aspects that generations after Gen X are really starting to focus much more on well-being, both within and outside work. And that's a dynamic we're certainly seeing a shift on. What I found really, really interesting, though, is that like 51% of people are actually actively looking and believe that they can find a role that pays as well or better. So, and just take a step back from that. That means every other person you look at in your workplace is actually of the opinion that they can get a job that pays just as well, if not better, elsewhere. So that's a big number. And that's why the whole aspect of competitive pay and fairness is just so critically important. So I guess I'm not surprised that pay is important. I was really surprised to get that sense that it's such a key topic, and that there's a sense that it's a really competitive market right now. And again, we know that from the war for talent, but the data is showing that as well. It's really driving us to understand that. Now, other things that are really key, and these are all aspects of what people are looking for in a new role, that playing to the strengths, and there's different dynamics on management philosophy around this. Do you try and take the rough edges off and get everyone to play well in different areas? Or do you just focus on strengths? Well, when you actually survey individuals, what they're looking for is to be in a role that plays to their strengths. And it kind of makes sense. To use a bad sporting analogy, like you're not going to rely on your goalkeeper to be the person who's scoring all the goals. It's probably useful if they can kick a ball, but it's not a key focus for them. So it's that kind of idea that you really should be looking to play to strengths, and I think that is important. But stability and security around the role are really key as well. And that sense of diversity, equality, and inclusion, and we'll touch a lot on that later on. There's a lot of legislation coming in this space, and there's some really prominent, really healthy stuff that it's introducing around understanding that sense of equality and fairness across an organization. So really good stuff. In terms of the employee experience overall, we think of this across UKG, we think of things called moments that matter. And there's a lot of these in any employee life cycle. They happen at different frequencies, but just getting a clear understanding that each of these impact on how people relate to the organization. Everything from the initial application process, what draws somebody in and attracts them to a role, what are the elements of culture that they relate to, and that they feel they'd like to be part of. That's really important. How do you attract that top talent? So that's the very start of the process. And that happens once in an employee's life cycle with your organization. So that being a positive starting point is really key. And technology has significantly influenced that outward perception. It's gone from being word of mouth or speaking to somebody who works in the organization to having a huge amount of transparency and very open, anonymous data, tools like Glassdoor, effectively externalizing an organization's culture. So having a really healthy culture that is consistent across an organization, it's not a nice to have anymore. It's an absolute fundamental requirement. But what's really cool about the pay area specifically is if you look across those moments that matter, and we've kind of highlighted the key ones at the start, that pay impacts on all of those. So the ability to execute payroll well and do that with modern technology that has a positive influence on employee experience, you're not just touching on a monthly basis. It impacts so much beyond how often you're paying the employee. And that ability to attract, hire, and retain is really key. So what are some of the things that when you're moving beyond the attraction process, when you're getting into hiring, how do we know that we're comping against the market? How do we know we're competitive and it will draw in the right type of talent, the top talent that any organization needs? So things like benchmarking and understanding, not just generic benchmarking, that it's relevant to the industry, to the location, to the type of organization you're operating in and where you want to position yourself. That's really important. That goes way beyond just the pure base pay. It looks at all the package components to make up total reward. And that's really important. Now, payroll obviously is a fundamental part of delivering that. So having modern integrated payroll technology that allows you to go from that attraction process all the way through hiring and onboarding, and then executing on that benefits component seamlessly and making sure that that's in a way that gets people's interest and motivation, and we'll touch on all of those things shortly. That's really key. So things like benefits platforms that can allow you to continue re-enroll in things that are important and make elections and choices that are relevant to life events that occur when they occur. That's all key to making sure that your workforce stays engaged that they're really bought into what's happening, and actually having a sense that the employer that they're working for is doing the right thing by them. And again, that relates back to different things being more important to different components of your workforce, different age categories, different social economic environments, and people having the freedom to choose across those different things can be really critical, and that can be a huge enabler for any organization. So think about those moments that matter, and each of these moments will matter differently to different people. And so having an understanding of the demographic of your population lets you understand better what to put more focus on. We can't do everything all at once. So where do you prioritize your effort? Well, data can lead you to that, and it can lead you to really having a clear understanding of it. Why do we care so much about that positive aspect of an employee experience? Well, it can mean a lot of different things, everything from how somebody feels about themselves, all the way through to how they're motivated within the organization and what they bring. So actually having an impact on that is just really critical. If you think back to the basic mechanics of somebody being employed, pay being such a critical factor, as we just talked about, it's the number one thing. Well, financial security is just so important to individuals. Like the anxiety and the stress that not having that brings can be actually incredibly crippling. It can actually disable somebody fundamentally in their role. It means they're disengaged from what they're doing. They're not fully present in the moment, and they're not delivering around that peer group and within the organization. So that part of it, number one, is just critically important. Not having that sense of financial anxiety, it's part of financial well-being and reducing financial stress. There's so many things that can be done around that that aren't necessarily to do with actually what it is you're paying. Providing education around financial well-being, budgeting assistance, proactive retirement planning, all those things do matter. And it's something even personally I worry about for my children and their generation. Like these things were taught in school when I went through school. So actually having the ability to budget and to manage your finances, like as a teenager, that was taught to us. It's not taught anymore as often. That's a skill set that doesn't come through. So that means that generations coming aren't getting that same leveling, and the sense of delayed gratification also that means they're planning for the future and they're actually comfortable doing that from an earlier age. That's stuff that as leaders in any organization, we have a responsibility to help put the structures in place to enable that for the whole population. And obviously, the earlier you do that, the bigger the impact it has, and the more enabled people will be. Now, the next piece then is the motivational aspect, offering competitive packages and financial incentives that give people the willingness to provide top level performance. It's really key. And again, it's not just the actual monetary value attached to that. It's the structure and form it comes in. Different roles will have different requirements for how people are comped. And you can take a simple example, might be a sales environment where it's commission based. Again, use a simple sporting analogy, you probably pay bonuses for goals scored. It doesn't matter what the industry is, what the context is, you've got to have a relevant structure. And that means having differentiation within the structure for different segments of the employee workforce. It can't be one size fits all, because not everybody's doing the same job. Not everybody's operating at the same level. Not everybody has the same responsibility. So having the ability to craft and architect something that fits across is really, really important. What you drive out of that is the ability to long-term retain and actually to build organizational capability within individuals, if you build that comp and structure properly. So that long-term incentive, that long-term structure and commitment, it really does pay dividends in terms of not having a revolving door situation. And that is becoming more challenging as we think about generations and the evolution of the workforce. The willingness to stay with an organization is getting shorter. Like all of the evidence is there from a data perspective. People's longevity with any one employer is shortening. The war for talent and the attraction of new resource that's consistently increasing. So how we look at this from a total reward point of view, from an enabling technology point of view, and actually giving people a sense of overall employee experience within the organization, it has a marked impact on how they react to the business. And ultimately how long you'll be able to retain them. Some of the other stuff, again, I'll touch on it in a sec, like the work-life balance aspect of that is really, really important. And what that enables people to do when they're not in work, I'm a huge personal believer that if you get that stuff right, and if people can have a really sound work-life balance, and if things at home and around them outside of work can be stable and well looked after, you get the best of them in work. And that's a really, really important part of what happens. So when you again go back to basic management theory, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the ability to provide for your family, and to do that with a sense of longevity, security, all those things, like that's where the benefits aspect can kick in beyond compensation side. So having benefit structures that look after the difficult scenarios. If something happens to an individual, how are their family provided for? Long term, what happens in critical illness? Those types of things, they're actually fundamental needs. They're not nice to have. They're the things that keep people awake, even if they don't always realize it. So actually having structures in place and using the data to drive what the appropriate structures are for your organization, that's really important. And again, having graduated access to that is really key. People have different requirements and different needs as their career progresses, and as their personal commitments either increase or decrease throughout their working career. So you've got to understand the demographic of the employee population to be able to treat that appropriately. So when I look at this from a personal perspective, I think everybody to some degree has a set of priorities they care about, and I kind of apply my own to this. So I think of like physical health and well-being being the fundamental pillar. If that's not right, I'm not going to be in a position to do much else. I then think about how I provide for family and how I look after and interact with and being present for my kids, and all that kind of stuff is really important. I then prioritize friends. And then after that, you do everything ethically. You really try and be your best self. That all matters. And then when those fundamental pillars are in place, everything else is what you want to do with it. And if you can get all those pieces right, and you can build structures, in my view anyway, if you can build the structures that allow you to facilitate that well, then you're really in a place where you engage, and you're in a place where you can bring all of yourself to the workplace, and you're actuated, and all of the stuff that was all part of management theory anyway. So it's just different perspective on how to look at this stuff, and that's kind of what helps me put it all together. Why do I think about that? Well, again, it's back to the same thing. You can't do everything all at once. So if you're only able to do one thing, make sure it's the right thing. Make sure it's the most important thing that has the most impact. And that's what I find useful to think about. Now, this stuff really matters because we find that when employees are happier in the workplace, they're twice as likely to be effective. Like, not just a little bit more likely, they're twice as likely to be effective. So that's a significant shift. So if you can get all of that stuff right, if you can put the right components in place across all of Comp and Ben, if you can understand the demographic and you can fit that together, it has a proven impact on your organization. People's ability to actually prioritize. Again, back to the same thing. If I can only do one thing, I want people working who can actually always pick out what the right thing is and to make sure they're doing it. And if everyone is always doing the right thing in the right order, you're going to have a highly effective organization. People only have a certain amount of time and energy to put into stuff. That's why that matters. It's really critical. It's focused on the right things, and that they can do that in a way they feel completely bought into. And they have a sense of how that fits into the bigger organizational picture. So that sense of belonging and sense of purpose in what they do is really important. And we'll see that in some of the data later on, that actually that's one of the biggest factors in people checking out. That if they don't have that sense of identifying with what they do, the importance of how it plays in the bigger picture, that can be a really negative thing as well. And then the key thing as well is, if you combine those two things, doing the right things and having a real sense of purpose and component of the organization thinking, then that lets them prioritize the stuff that most benefits the business, which ultimately is why we employ. We need people to engage in what it is the business is there to do. So all of that kind of fits together. When you actually take a step back from it, it's highly, highly logical. So how people feel at work, it does impact our entire life. And I suspect anyone in any kind of pressured role will have experienced that at times. When that pressure increases, it doesn't stay in the workplace. It will follow you home, and it can be really, really challenging. So that's why having the right structures in place to try and manage that is really critical. Like impact on people's self-confidence, quality of life, satisfaction in what they do. If these things start to get hindered or damaged, then very quickly an employee will start to look for a change. And the simplest change to make, particularly in a highly competitive talent environment, is to walk away. So it's really important that we proactively manage all of these different dynamics. We understand how people fit into the organization. We help them understand their purpose, things like career trajectory and movement. Like it doesn't have to be moving to a different organization to change components of what they enjoy or don't enjoy. It can be moving laterally within a career framework. All of that stuff really empowers individuals to engage with an organization. But the impact of being stressed or uncomfortable at work, it does magnify. So actually having a clear handle on how we can positively impact that is really, really important for anyone around that. And again, payroll is at the heart of that. If it's not a core component, then it's difficult for the other stuff to be right. It does impact retention. So when people look at equity and fairness in what they're paid, if they feel they're not being paid fairly for the work they do, if they feel that it's not either fair to market, even fair to peers, even if they're paid well versus market, but peers around them are known to be paid substantially differently, that's enough to drive change. That level of stress and the impact that has, again, it comes up there. So no surprise, like that covers the top nearly 60% of reasons to consider other opportunities. When you combine that with the fact that we saw earlier, more than half of people are already looking, it doesn't take much of a combination of difficult scenarios to have somebody leave an organization. So we can impact this stuff, and we can impact it in simple way by understanding what we need to do and understanding the types of people in our organization. I think some of these secondary factors kind of feed in, like that not feeling energized. That's down to potentially some of the primary factors, and once you start to disengage, it quickly spirals. So they're all things to consider, but it does have a huge impact. It impacts people in the workforce, but it also impacts people you're trying to bring into that workforce. And we'll touch in a little bit on the concepts of transparency. So there's two pieces: there's equity and there's transparency. Transparency is actually fundamentally important within an organization, but it's becoming actually more legislated as well. And it does have an impact on our ability to attract talent. So like some of the statistics across the bottom here, I found really interesting when we were researching this. If you don't have a clear sense of what a role pays, like first of all, I'd love to know who the 2% are that don't think you should tell what a role is paid. Fair play for booking the trend, but I think most people would agree that I'd like to know what a role pays before I proactively chase it. But actually, what's interesting is more than half of individuals would not engage in a role and would not apply for a role if there wasn't a sense of what the comp was for that. Are we surprised by that? I don't think so. Like, why would you be applying if pay is so fundamentally important, which I think we all believe it is? And if you don't know what that is, then why would you apply for a role? It's kind of common sense. But what's interesting is that very quickly drops off as well. So even if you get through and it's known, if it's not clear, then you wouldn't go to an interview. A third of people wouldn't attend an interview if the range available for that salary wasn't known. So that's why I would encourage engaging with the concepts of transparency, because number one, it's coming from a legislative perspective quite aggressively, which I do think is a good thing. But secondarily, then it's very clear that not embracing it does have a marked impact on our ability to attract and retain people. So when we look at those engagement drivers, it really does, and it has been proven that your ability to retain increases, your ability, employee security and sense of security in a role is fundamentally changed, and your ability to use technology to train and retain people, it's really an important part of enabling that, really important part of enabling that. So that employee well-being piece, we can positively impact it. We can engage people to drive to drive retention, to drive attractiveness to a role. But it's important that we proactively do that. Now, some of the other stuff that's interesting around the ability to innovate and to actually focus on what is it the employee cares about in the payroll environment, it's beyond just getting paid. So some of the things we think about is what's the information we're providing to the employee through the payroll environment. Just the pure core payslip, that's the starting point, that's table stakes. But what insight are they getting from that? And how do you layer that with other components of technology to actually bring together understanding of their long-term financial well-being, their contribution to savings, 401k pensions, and actually elevating that, as well as different methods for actually being paid. That's a really, really important part of bringing the whole picture together. So there's a huge diversity in what that is, the different technology available, but actually having a technology-led approach to payroll that joins up all those feeding components around comp and ben, around HR changes, workforce management, bringing all of that into the center is really key. And actually thinking first about, go back to the moments that matter and how each of those is touched by the technology that underpins your organization. It's just so important because every single one of those moments will matter differently to different people at different stages of their career. So it's not a one size fits all. It's important to get that right. Think about where payroll plays a leading role in this. And there's kind of three core components. Accuracy of payroll, again, is a kind of given. It pretty much needs to be accurate. Otherwise, we've got a problem. It's wrong. So that's one dimension. The trust and transparency. We'll talk a lot about transparency. Like payroll being accurate, being on time, it does build trust in an organization. Having more transparency builds further trust, because if we're more open about things, then there's more insight for everybody. It's shared information, and people can more actively understand where they fit, how they can progress, what's available to them as they do it. That's important. And being able to present that in a way that can be effectively a consumerized experience is the terminology. How can people digest that? How can they take the different pieces at different times? How is it easily digestible? That's really, really key. All of these impact on employee experience. So like take the accuracy as table stakes, and then let's talk about the other components around trust, transparency, and consumerization. Accuracy, there's a lot of different ways that you can start to impact accuracy of payroll. I kind of look at payroll as a black box in many ways, that it's effectively a right or wrong process. Payroll is calculated generally in a legislative way, unless today's budget has blown that up and we've a lot of stuff to work on because of that. But there is a specific way payroll is calculated in most geographies. There are some that you have choice, but pretty much right or wrong. If that's not right more than twice, again, you're impacting your ability to retain staff. Believe me, even more so if you're a payroll organization, then you don't even get two goes at that. So it's really key that that is on time and it is accurate. The other piece that we need to think about is if that isn't paid accurately and on time, it can have a really serious repercussion, almost a ripple impact through somebody's personal financial situation. It can be anything from direct debits or withdrawals for mortgages being missed, people going into arrears, those types of things. And whilst, yes, financially that could be quickly and easily remedied, it takes time, effort, and creates a huge amount of stress for the individual that they just didn't expect and wouldn't have expected and shouldn't have been expecting. So that kind of stuff has a really significant order of magnitude impact on how people perceive the organization that they work for and their willingness to do things for it. So really key that we get that right. So how do we get this right? How do we really positively impact that accuracy of payroll? So much of that is down to the inputs that go into payroll. If you think of that black box process, it's going to calculate the way it calculates. What's the variable? Well, the variable is what you put into it. So having accurate employee records, having HR system of record, HCM, human capital management system in play, and having that with clean data. And actually, when you think about the data you're managing, it's employee data. Who knows the person best? They do. the individual knows the person best. That's why self-service is such a critical component, not because it's nice to have, which it's incredibly important to have from an employee experience point of view, but it actually elevates your ability to deliver a good service to those employees. Let them author their own data. Let them look after changing their own bank details. Let them input their own dependents. It's actually something that, by and large, individual employees will self-manage and self-police, given the right access. They want their own record to be right. And you'll actually get a lot more data and a lot more useful information that you can actually then use to cut and understand what you have if you give them that access to it. Make sure you've got them classified correctly. That can mean a lot of different things. That depends on the legislative environment. When you think about gender pay equity, that's one dimension, ethnicity is another. And again, that varies by locale as to whether you can, should or shouldn't ask those things. But understanding the bigger picture of how you want to use the data is really important. Having the end in mind, really being abreast of what legislative change is coming so that you can actually gather that information in a proactive and positive way to drive the right changes. Things like time tracking and workforce management is becoming really, really critical. It's always been important in certain contexts and environments, but things like gender pay equity, it's not just about adding up the components of pay. It's actually looking at what the working environment, working time for the individuals is as well. And actually it forces, like the UK legislation on this is really good. It's really clever. It makes sure that you're not able to cheat the system. It looks at how many hours people work, what the type of pay they're getting is it additional time worked? Like just because somebody's paid more, it's not necessarily wrong if they've worked for more hours. So it's actually taking into account not just the pay aspects, but the time dimension of that as well. It's really, really important. Getting into conducting regular audits, well, actually, I like to think of this stuff with the right technology in place to enable a HR and payroll organization. It actually becomes less about the forensic audit process that's on an ad hoc or a regular basis, but actually using the data and the analytics to drive proactive outcomes, looking for the outliers, looking at normalized populations, being able to see things in a standardized way. It actually means you're moving from a reactive audit-based environment to a much more proactive set of controls. But secondly, you're able to do that at scale. You can do it consistently across whatever the different employee populations are, whatever countries they're employed in, whatever currencies they're paid in. It actually becomes a really simple thing to do with the right technology in place. So a huge enabler for any organization. Now, where we lead away from a payroll perspective, trust and transparency, well, I think fundamentally you build trust by the accuracy of payroll and that always being right and always being done for the right reasons. But we do need to think about the trust and transparency pieces separately. So think about transparency, first of all. That means the openness of what it is we're paying and why we're paying it. And then once you have that, think about the equity piece of it, as in, is it equal? Is it something for the same thing in the same place, same role? Are we being fair and balanced in how we look at that? And there's still a huge disparity in that. And there's disparities in many different ways. It's not just gender-based disparity. Ethnicity is one sample. So this is just purely, this is localized to the UK environment, looking across ethnic diversity within an organization and what the pay gap is on an hourly basis. And this is a great example of why the combination of payroll and workforce management data is really important. Just looking at the take-home pay in isolation, it's not enough. You could have somebody who's working 2 days a week versus 5 days a week. You would expect the person working 5 days a week would be paid more. Those 2 days a week could be 14-hour shifts versus the person working 5 days a week, working 5 half days. Like the time dimension is absolutely critical to getting to useful data that's comparable across these different areas, plus the HCM aspect of capturing the ethnicity to be able to do that. So start to think of all the different ways that you would want to cut that data, and you'd want that to be balanced and fair no matter how you cut it. Now, it's difficult to do that, obviously, in any organization, because once you pivot in one direction on something, it starts to skew something else. So understanding what the core dimensions you're looking at are really important. Gender is always a key one. Now, it's really interesting to see how this has progressed over probably the last 3 years. And I do think the UK particularly is pushing really hard on legislation on this. And I think it's been important to do that. I was 800 out of circa 1,000 organizations surveyed who could get a better outcome. That's moved a lot. It's moved a lot in a positive direction, but it does show that there's still huge disparity in gender pay equality. 800 companies with zero pay gap, and that's an aggregate zero. Does that mean it's absolutely zero across everything? I doubt it. So the devil is always in the detail, and actually being able to get to that detail and look for the outliers is important for any employer. Payroll is fundamental in enabling that. Having good payroll data in structured systems that you can actually use to drive outcomes, that's the only way these types of things are changed. And the only way we can actually drive informed change for the right reasons. Now, what impact does that have? It's really, really quite stark that 47% versus 27% between women and men not having spare money after the monthly outgoings to do something with. That's the impact of not driving gender pay equity across an organization. Again, tech is a core part of enabling that, and it's something that every organization should be looking at. I'll talk a little bit in a second. We've got a poll in a minute about the transparency aspect, but transparency actually fundamentally enables this type of activity to happen, and it happens in a much broader way once you get to transparency. So maybe we'll jump to the next poll question, Mel, if that's okay. So does your team analyze or report out on pay gaps across demographic groups? And that's not necessarily just gender. It could be age-based bias. It could be ethnic groupings. It could be across different geographies. Just getting a sense of where organizations are overall in actually analyzing this.
So we've got people answering it already. What do you think's going to be the top answer on this one, Richard?
I would say it will be much more skewed towards yes. And I would say probably the second answer around we've just begun or we're reasonably well underway, but more to do would probably be the way I would pitch it.
Okay. If anybody's got any other comments, please feel free to add them to the chat as well. Because sometimes on the poll, somebody always wants to add something else. So please feel free to do that. I'm just going to leave it open just for a few more seconds. So if you haven't answered, if you could, that'd be fantastic. I always have my little number I like to hit, and we're a bit away from that at the moment. But it's an important topic, isn't it?
It is, and like it's interesting. I'd ask anyone if they're not involved in UK payroll, it's worth just grabbing some of the. There's some really good white papers on the UK gender pay equity aspects that have been put through legislation. They're actually really simple, and the way they've been structured is what I love about it is it's very difficult to cheat it. It's been thought through in a way that takes into account different classifications of worker, like comparing white collar to blue collar equally, all of those different things. It's actually demystified a lot of the really challenging stuff that you'd have to work out for yourself. And it does travel across borders. Whilst it's obviously a UK legislation, you could actually universally apply it anywhere and get the same defined outcomes that it's trying to draw.
So Gerard has added that it might be done for HR, but I know more payroll people are involved in this.
Yeah, that can be the case.
Sorry, Richard.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. It can often be the case, and what's really challenging for anyone trying to analyze and drive organizational change using HR, payroll, or WFM data, if it's not drawn together in a meaningful way in a system that enables you, what tends to happen is you're working with different teams to try and pull something else and merge data together offline. And it just disables, you get this kind of fatigue process around actually driving the change. Whereas if you're actually presenting it in a way that you can slice and play with the information without necessarily having to have the defined question first, like if you can just play with data without having a question in mind, I've often found that's where you get the really insightful stuff you never even expected. You solve a problem you didn't even know that was there, because it wasn't manifesting, but actually it has the biggest impact.
Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. There you go. Can you see the results?
Yeah, I'm really surprised. Surprised how many have no plans. Interesting. Really interesting. That will change depending on where you're located. It'll have to change because there's, and I'll talk about it in a minute. There's a lot of legislation coming. A lot of that's EU driven at the moment, EEA. But it will force every organization with a population over a certain size. I think the cutoff's about 100 people in the org. It's coming thick and fast. So it's very important that we do start to look at this stuff. And it does mean as well that because it's legislatively driven, a lot of technology providers will be actually enabling that to happen as a byproduct of what you do. So it's a really, really key part of it. It's something we've always had front and center within Amidus, the warm view component of UKG, actually taking the best we can from every legislation and trying to put that into the center so you can use it even if you don't have to. It's a really key enabler. But what's interesting is a lot of organizations, very different to the poll outcome. This was Mercer research, but are very aware, like 3/4 of organizations are going to be addressing pay equity. And that's pay equity from many different dimensions as part of their comm strategy going forwards. And that's good to see. It does still mean that 1 in 4 are not. Which is interesting because these weren't small organizations surveyed. But the other piece of this is just looking at it is one part. Actually having the insight to come to a meaningful outcome and drive organizational change, it's really hard to do. And that has to be led from the top of an organization. It has to be really driven and as part of the corporate strategy to be able to address that formally. So onto transparency. Think of this as a component or certainly a very heavily influencing factor of equity. But that sense of engagement with an organization, it is impacted by how transparent we think they're being, how open is the comm process, how broadly known is the information around, say, for example, mins and maxes, pay bands for a particular role across different geographies. There is a balance to be had here. And a lot of the research that came here, a lot of the stuff we researched around this, actually, interestingly, would say that you've got to find a middle ground between no transparency at all and over transparency. And as an example, what I mean by that, having transparency across what you expect to pay on average or a min and a max for a particular role is one piece, but openly publishing what individuals are paid who are currently in that role, like that's your extreme scenario of over transparency. That's not a good environment to be in. And I often actually think of examples would be like public sector, UK, Ireland, and many other public sector environments, particularly heavily unionized environments. They tend to have much more transparency around roles and actually much more definition around where the starting point for a grade is, what the expectation of progression across grades are, and even like increments that would occur at specific points in time. That's probably, it's a prescriptive structure, and it does mean that a lot of the flexibility comes out of that. And it does mean that, and it's not always the case at all, but what you can see in that environment is that the contra action is that people can coast through that because they'll just progress regardless of delivery. So there's a real balance to be had in what the right structure is between no transparency at all and hyper transparency. But certainly there is a drive towards more and more transparency in pay structure, and there is legislation coming around this as well. So how do you actually positively impact the transparency around comm structures? Sorry, more so what happens from a negative point of view, and how does it impact retention? It's not as profound as pay itself, and you'll see that in the numbers. Like pay was the high 40s, low 50s impact on people starting to look for a new role, whereas here we're talking kind of 1 in 5s or less. But it does have an impact, and it's not a small number. So if you can turn the dial on the pay aspect first and then the dial on this, you're flipping somebody from 60%, 70% looking around and actively moving on to being able to proactively retain them. So all of these things do factor up. It goes back, think back to like, do the right thing, do only one thing. If that's all you can do, impact the biggest things first. Well, impact the pay components and the comp and ben structure, then look at the transparency piece and moving towards a more transparent structure. Ultimately, it's easier to manage. And it does give you a tool to attract and retain people with. You'll see a lot of organizations actually publish some of that data now proactively in terms of what they're willing to comp, what the benefits packages are, typically available on their websites. And that would tend to be for bigger organizations. It's a difficult thing to do certainly from my own experiences in a startup environment, it's certainly not something you would ever do. And that's why some of the legislation here would be quite particular about the size of organization. Like economically, that might not work for a smaller organization, which is why it would talk, for example, around over 100 people, these things start to kick in. It's the same on many things in payroll. It's the requirement to comply with government gateways for real-time information would kick in over 20 people in some geographies. That type of stuff, it's got to be in a way that allows businesses to still operate, but driving with the right things in mind. So steps to improving pay transparency and fairness, getting to that fair structure, and doing an initial analysis of where we stand. It's back to the same things, like do we know what generation our employee demographic is in? Maybe not. Do we know how that's broken down by people who are in the same role, and how their pay differs within that role? That can be really hard to do as well if we actually don't have, for example, consistent job titles, or it's free-form job titles. Again, can be really challenging in a smaller organization. Moving to a consistent structure around job architecture can be really key to actually being able to analyze the data at scale, and be able to do that in a meaningful way. So actually do the analysis. Like that's got to, in any situation, if you measure where you are now, no different to managing a project. If you have a baseline plan, you can then manage deviation from it. If you do an initial analysis of where you are now, good, bad, or indifferent, and be willing and be open about what you find, even if there are some real outliers that you might not like to hear from a HR perspective, you need to be able to look and you need to be open to doing that. And then actionable insights, you've got to be willing to do something about it. That'll drive employee sentiment, but you've got to listen. And different aspects, it's back to understanding the breakdown and the makeup of the different groupings of your population, however you divide that up. Different things have different levels of importance. There could be geographically, there could be aspects of what people expect as base compensation, base benefits in one country, which are totally alien and would never happen in another. You have to listen and you have to explore and understand what they are, because they can be, back to the really important stuff, they can be very small monetarily, but they can be a hygiene factor. Well, if another organization is offering it, I'm going there. So you've got to be willing to explore that stuff. You've got to have open conversations with your population, and you've got to do that in two ways. It's got to be balanced in terms of listening to what it is they expect and managing that expectation. Think again, employee experience, management of expectation. It's got to be a two-way thing as well. There will be some things as an employee you don't want to encourage, don't want to do, and probably shouldn't be doing. And giving active, open feedback as to why that is and why you compensate for that in other ways, that's really important. Building that trust and understanding in both directions, it's really, really important. And then the last piece will become critically important, and you'll see on the next slide, actually preparing for that external reporting. We should all be prepared. It's kind of a word of caution, really. So much more of this information is going to be publicly and openly externalized in future. It's just the way things are going. It's the way that every aspect of life is going. Things that wouldn't have been shared previously are up on social media. It's the same. Think of the very same thing with pay data. It's being more publicly and openly shared. That started with, take for example, real-time information, or STP, the immediate feedback of payroll outcomes and results to government parties. That's broadening out now. That was just the starting point of having the data, what it's used for and what it drives. That becomes incredibly important now. That's a real changer in terms of what we're doing. This will apply to organizations of any size. So in terms of looking at gender pay gap, bringing in, to my point earlier, around all the variable components and normalizing for that. You can't hide stuff. It's really prescriptive in terms of how it behaves, nor should you be looking to. So actually having that transparency from the outset, that's really important. Understanding that breakdown, and it's not just gender pay equity. It's really important to understand that it's all different aspects of how this impacts people. It could be down to looking, for example, if people have been out on maternity leave, have they fallen behind because they've missed pay reviews? Those types of things will be brought to the surface. It's really important to understand that and to make sure that we're ready for the transparency that comes with it. And that's going to be key. So the last piece I'd call out on that is just the very bottom piece around category of workers. That's a really broad term, and it should be. It should mean different things in different organizations as to how we look at the workforce in our organization. It should differ. It will differ by industry. It will differ by geography. It will differ by scale and size of your organization. All those things will matter. So actually having the data there to play with and to be able to slice it in different ways to fulfill this is really key. So last piece around consumerizing payroll. How do we pull all this together, and the importance of technology? I was surprised by the research on this from Montana, that actually only 51% of the surveyed organizations felt technology is important in the employee experience. I think it's fundamentally important, because if it's deployed in the right way, and if it's deployed with the right components, then it actually fundamentally changes an employee's level of engagement. Actually, a friend of mine recently moved role and actually gave me some really interesting insight about their onboarding experience with a major employer, major global employer. Absolutely first class onboarding experience. It was made so super simple for every piece of information. It was really interesting to hear that, and their level of excitement around the move of the role, which could be a daunting thing, was right up there. It had massively brought them into where they were going and how much the organization cared about their experience being a good one. So it really does matter, and I would argue that technology should be far higher here. 9% somewhat important, but like overall, I would see it as one of the most fundamental enablers once the cultural aspects are right. So
Sorry
yeah.
to disturb you. We're just a few minutes away from the hour.
No worries, we're very nearly there. So I'm going to close out on a couple more slides, and then we'll jump to the last poll, I think is the key thing. So I'll jump past this, and just in terms of digital experience, global organizations, 60% of them engaging and addressing that employee experience aspect. 5 is an interesting number for HCM components: core HR, payroll, workforce management, things like benefits provision, really fundamentally important in that. And then very likely applicant tracking and onboarding experiential stuff would be the core components around that digital experience. But getting on for 2/3 of organizations will be addressing that in the near future. So that digital experience, it's really key. It's got to include payroll, because ultimately payroll is that fundamental pillar, and so many of those things upstream impact on payroll, absolutely fundamentally drive a payroll outcome. And as we found out earlier on, if the payroll outcome's not right, then we're in serious trouble, and not much else matters. So on that note, I think we'll jump now to the last poll, Mel. So poll question: what is or will be your next focus area to enhance your organization's employee experience through payroll specifically?
So thank you to everyone who has been answering the polls. They're really interesting. It's really interesting insights to what the audience thinks. So Richard, what do you reckon on this one?
I'm gonna Yes, the middle one, trust and transparency. And I'm saying that simply because I'm taking payroll accuracy as table stakes. It can't not be.
Okay. Right, we'll just give it a few more seconds. If you haven't answered, if you could just answer, that'd be fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll in a couple of seconds. It's quite interesting, actually. There you go. Here are the results.
There we go, guessed it.
You got it right.
Only just though. Interesting, very interesting. I wonder what I would say probably on the bottom one, on the consumerized technology experience. Again, I wonder if maybe that's because the people who answered that way would say that I'm not even going to vote on payroll accuracy, it's a given, and trust and transparency, it's coming anyway. But yeah, very, very interesting. So maybe last takeaway, thank you everybody for your time today. Really appreciate it. Mel, thank you very much for organizing the session and for having me back. Really appreciate that. One takeaway would be really start to explore, particularly transparency and equity, how they're going to impact your organization depending on where you're operating. I would look at what's happening in other legislative areas as well outside your own, because these things do follow suit very quickly. And what will tend to happen is the most proactive and most beneficial legislations are easy to copy and easy to go sideways across other geographies. So like this is coming. And please do, as organizations, embrace it and embrace all the good stuff that will drive for your organization and for you within the payroll part of that organization as an outcome from it. So thanks for your time today, everybody.
No, thank you so much, Richard. Really interesting presentation, and there's a lot of takeaways from this. So as I said, we will share the slides, but thank you so much. There has been a couple of questions about UKG, and we'll ask Richard and his team to go back to those people in particular about that. So thanks once again, Richard, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks ever so much, Mel. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.